Chapter 7. Jack Shit. I'd been in Jack's house for less than 5 minutes when he sadly confessed, "God can never forgive me." Jack was very tall and lean, gangly is the word, and chronic back pain left him bent over at the waist like a crooked piece of elbow macaroni. His blue jeans looked 3 sizes too big and were held up precariously by bright red fireman suspenders. Very witty, sadly charming, and warmly hospitable, Jack reminded me of an incarnate Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. He was woefully forlorn and depressed, but in an endearing way. You just wanted to hug him. An avid student of the Bible and an active member of a local fundamentalist church, Jack was sure God could never forgive him. "Wow," I said. "Can I get your autograph?" His head snapped up from his rocking chair, and he peered at me with those dark, deeply set eyes full of suspicion. "What? Why?" "Well, I've never met anyone before who claimed to be more powerful than God," I said. "What do you mean?" he asked reluctantly. "Well, if I understand you right, you're telling me your ability to sin is greater than God's ability to forgive." Jack stroked his long, pointy chin for several seconds, then, smiling, he sheepishly admitted, "I guess that is what I'm saying." We both laughed out loud. Over the course of my visits with him, Jack shared about his life, his broken marriage, his love for God, and his fear of dying. He never did tell me what awful sin he'd committed that caused his spiritual angst. On one occasion, though, he did share a deeply painful memory. Jack told me that as his father was dying, his father had told another family member that Jack had been a great disappointment to him. Jack and his father had always had an ambiguous relationship. Jack's dad had been a larger-than-life figure, a football star known not only for breaking tackles but also for breaking women's hearts, including the heart of Jack's sainted mother. Jack both loved and hated his father. Jack longed desperately for his father's approval, yet also feared he would become like his dad. What a coincidence that this man who struggled for, yet never received his father's affection, would worship a God for whom he was never quite good enough. Now, each week at our hospice team, the nurses, social workers, home health aides, a doctor, pharmacist, and chaplain gathered to discuss the progress of each patient to ensure that we were doing the best we could for each of them. At one of those weekly meetings, Jack's nurse mentioned that Jack was obsessed about having movements of his bowels. The goal of Jack's days, she shared, was to have a BM. As the nurse shared this quirk of Jack's behavior, I sat there and had a stroke of insight. Jack can't let go of his shit, physically or spiritually. Somehow, during those months as Jack was dying, his thirsty soul was slacked by the waters of grace. Now, maybe it was as Aeschylus portrayed that God's awful grace came to Jack during those long, sleepless nights when he lay awake perseverating about his bowels. I don't know. But I do know that Jack came to a deep measure of peace before he died. Somehow, he became convinced that God really did forgive him and love him. On my last visit with Jack before he died, he told me he wasn't afraid anymore, but he still prayed that God would just let him die one night during his sleep. I teasingly responded, "Jack, everybody wants that." Jack admitted that he was inconsistent. He wanted to die peacefully, but he also wanted to do everything possible to stay alive. Jack taught me consistency is overrated. We're all inconsistent. It's simply part of being human. Before he died, Jack experienced grace, the merciful, loving acceptance he so longed for all of his life. This somehow enabled Jack to finally let go of his shit and enjoy an important freedom, the freedom to die in peace. I can confirm that this was no small task. Sometimes letting go of your shit requires a Herculean effort. The wager. According to the ancient Greek myth, one of the 12 labors of Hercules was to clean out the Aegean stables. King Augeas was the richest man in Greece at the time, the owner of thousands of head of cows, bulls, goats, sheep, and horses. Every night, his workers brought the animals back to their stables, which had never been cleaned out. The pile of shit was legendary. Augeas bet Hercules that he couldn't clean out the stables in one day. Hercules accepted the challenge and came up with an ingenious plan. He grabbed a shovel and walked right past the huge pile of dung, didn't even look at it. Instead, Hercules started digging a trench at the back of the stables in the direction of two nearby rivers, the Alpheus and the Peneus. When he released their banks, the two rivers merged and created such a huge surge of water that it washed all the crap from the stables, redistributing it to the depleted fields below that were in desperate need of fertilizing. The moral of the story is that we sometimes find our shit so overwhelming that we simply can't get rid of it. So instead of endlessly shoveling crap, maybe it's a better idea to dig a trench to the source of grace, to that place of love and acceptance, and allow grace to flow down and wash away our filth. It might even become fertilizer, enriching our life and the lives of others. Hide and seek. My dear friend Jack had hit the trifecta. He had relational problems with himself, with others, and with God. Now, some folks would argue these are all one and the same. I disagree. I will concede, however, that these three are deeply interconnected and not easily separated. If we violate one of these relationships, the others will surely be affected. Now, I suspect some of you will be freaked out if I bring up at this point the word sin. And I understand it does come with a lot of baggage. But one thing all of the major faith traditions agree on is we human beings have a problem. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity call it sin. Taoism and Buddhism teach that we are all asleep and need to be awakened. 12-step groups tell us we have imperfections. But these belief systems all agree that we human beings are not fully what we were meant to be. In the well-known story from the Bible, we're told of how God's garden became polluted by the weeds of sin, the Bible's word for this soul sickness that has infected us all. Although God commanded that the humans not eat from the tree in the center of the garden, the serpent suggested they would not die from eating the forbidden fruit. Instead, they would become enlightened. And then we read, "When the woman saw that the tree looked like good eating and realized what she would get out of it, she'd know everything. She took and ate the fruit and then gave some to her companion, and he ate. Immediately the two of them did see what's really going on, saw themselves naked. They sewed fig leaves together as makeshift clothes for themselves. When they heard the sound of God strolling in the garden in the evening breeze, the man and the woman hid in the trees of the garden, hid from God. God called to the man and woman, 'Where are you?' He said, 'I heard you in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid.'" Now, what is Yahweh's reaction to this devastation for the divine plan? Does God come exploding onto the scene in scolding tones, threatening, "Get out here, you two. I told you if you ate my fruit, I'd give you what for. I'm going to squash you both like the ungrateful bugs you are"? Quite the contrary. And what comes is a complete shock. Yahweh, is depicted as an out-of-her-mind, grief-stricken mother careening through the mall on Christmas Eve, desperately screaming at the top of her lungs for a beloved child that has been lost. Where are you? The Almighty Creator's response to our choice of going it alone on this third rock from the sun is a broken-hearted scream that rattles the universe with Big Bang fury. Where are you? This scream, by the way, was echoed thousands of years later on an obscure hill called Golgotha by the second Adam, whose tormented cry was, my God, where are you?" Sort of changes things, doesn't it? Instead of a big bad boogeyman God who is so disappointed in you, one who can't wait for you to cross some imaginary moral line in the sand so you can be discarded like yesterday's garbage into the ash heap of hell, this passage portrays a grieving parent who scours the landscape in search of lost children. What if all that fury, fire, and fearsomeness used to describe God in the Old Testament is really about God's love for us and not God's judgment of us? Crazy? The written record of Hebrew seers is spiced with ecstatic utterances from prophets and lovers intoxicated by this living, incomprehensible passion of the divine other. The prophet Isaiah wrote, "Can a mother forget the baby at her breast and have no compassion on the child she has borne? Though she may forget, I will not forget you. See, I have engraved you on the palms of my hands." And the prophet Zephaniah wrote, "The Holy One, your God, is with you. Yahweh is mighty to save. Yahweh will take great delight in you. Yahweh will quiet you with love. Yahweh will rejoice over you with singing." Now contrast this with the response of the human beings. They hid. They hid from God, they hid from each other, and they hid from themselves. The sad reality is we are all still hiding. We hide, God seeks. A travel agent for guilt trips. Now, the major side effect of this sin problem is it causes relational breakdown. We become more distant from others, from ourselves, and from God. I bring all this up because I've observed that folks with relational problems generally have more pain at the end of life than those who don't. A lot more. There are exceptions, of course, like patients who have a tumor pressing against the nerve. But by and large, it's the people with a large amount of existential relational pain that require more analgesics to find comfort as death approaches. I've met many people like Jack who are acutely aware of their problem, and after more than 50 years in ministry, the only antidote to this relational problem I've discovered is forgiveness. In fact, I can't remember one troubled person I've counseled with or prayed with for whom forgiveness was not an issue. Not one. I'll go a step further and say I know of no more powerful or effective spiritual tool than forgiveness. One of those enigmatic stories Jesus told, called parables, has a lot to do with this very issue. Jesus taught, "Therefore the kingdom of heaven is like a king who wanted to settle accounts with his servants. As he began the settlement, a man who owed him 10,000 talents was brought to him. Since he was not able to pay, the master ordered that he and his wife and his children and all that he had be sold to repay the debt. The servant fell on his knees before him. 'Be patient with me,' he begged, 'and I'll pay you back everything.' The servant's master took pity on him, canceled the debt, and let him go. But when that servant went out, he found one of his fellow servants who owed him 100 denarii. He grabbed him and began to choke him. 'Pay back what you owe me,' he demanded. His fellow servant fell to his knees and begged him, "Be patient with me. I'll pay you back." But he refused. Instead, he went off and had the man thrown into prison until he could repay the debt. When the other servants saw what had happened, they were greatly distressed and went and told their master everything that had happened. Then the master called the servant in. "You wicked servant," he said. "I canceled all of that debt of yours because you begged me to. Shouldn't you have had mercy on your fellow servant just as I had on you?" In anger, his master turned him over to the jailers to be tortured until he could pay back all that he owed. And then Jesus concludes this loving little story. "This is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother from your heart." To really appreciate what Jesus was talking about here, I think we need to understand the amounts of money referenced in the story. Now, the tax of an entire nation of Israel paid to Rome in 1 year at that time added up to 1,000 talents. So 10,000 talents would be the equivalent of 10 years' worth of taxes for the whole nation. By contrast, 100 denarii would be about $2,000 in our currency. So here we have a servant who has squandered billions of dollars with nothing to show for it, not the brightest bulb on the tree. And as ridiculous as it might seem, he asks the king for more time to pay the debt back. How much time do you think the servant will need to save enough from his minimal wages to pay back billions of dollars? Laughable, isn't it? Well, the point is, this is a debt that could never be repaid. Yet the servant begs for more time as if it will make a difference. Note that the king does not grant the servant's request. The king does not give the servant more time to pay the debt back. In an incredible act of generosity, the king cancels the debt, writes off billions of dollars with a stroke of a pen. Now, you would think the servant would be jumping out of his skin with gratitude, joy, and excitement. Talk about hitting the lottery. Shockingly, as soon as he leaves the king's presence, he finds a guy who owes him about $2,000, throttles the guy, and demands the money he is owed. Now, right about here, the story breaks down for most of us. How is the servant's behavior to be believed? Who could be so ungrateful? I think the servant really had no way of comprehending what had just taken place in the king's presence. He was so stressed out about what he owed, so afraid about the torture that he, his wife, and his children might face, that he simply did not understand his unrepayable debt had been forgiven. He asked for more time, but the king canceled the debt. Yet tragically, the servant did not understand what the king had done. He left the king's presence thinking he now had more time to pay back a debt, and he goes out looking for everyone owing him money so he can pay the debt that has already been canceled. It's crazy. It's crazy. I understand it. A number of years ago, when I was still working as a travel agent for Guilt Trips, I was preaching on this very text at my church, and I was coming up to the big wrap-up, the altar call. You've probably seen it on TV. People come to the front of the church crying, asking to be saved or forgiven or the like. I could see the folks squirming in the pews. "And you're just like this servant," I was bellowing. "God's forgiven you so much, a debt you could never repay, and you still hold grudges." I was laying it on pretty thick when God started to speak to me. There I was, reminding this crowd of people how unforgiving they all were, when God interrupted me. Unfortunately, I can multitask, which means my mouth will sometimes continue working even when my brain is disengaged. You can just ask my wife. So I continued preaching even while having an inner dialogue with God. God said, "You're the man." "What do you mean by that?" I replied, hoping to hear God say what a fine instrument I was for bringing about conviction, which is the job of the Holy Spirit, by the way. But God had a different word for me. "You're the guilty one. You're just like the servant in this story. I've forgiven all the hurtful things you've ever pulled, but you are still emotionally shaking down everyone in your life because you think they're the ones keeping you from being the perfect man you think I want." Unbelievably, I just kept preaching, making those in attendance feel guilty while I continued my own inner dialogue with God. "You're angry with your church," God continued, "because they're not bringing more people to hear you preach. Somehow you think my love for you is based on how big the congregation is. And you're angry at your wife and your infant son because he isn't sleeping through the night, so you have to act like a father and help care for him, which means you have less time to pray and study the Bible. You believe your wife and your child are keeping you from being the holy man you think I want you to be. You act like you think I'm an ogre." With that, I mercifully shut up. Busted. Right there, at the big altar call, I humbly stood in front of my family and friends and confessed that I was the wicked servant. I was the one who desperately needed to hear the altar call that morning. I asked them to forgive me and pray for me. The poor servant in Jesus' story simply didn't understand he had been forgiven. Neither had I. Jesus concluded his story by saying that the servant was handed over to the tormentors. That's what happens when we choose not to forgive. We are the ones who are tormented. I saw a vivid portrayal of this torment when I went to the Oregon Shakespeare Festival's production of The Merchant of Venice here in Ashland. Theater companies are often reluctant to present this Shakespearean comedy because of all the anti-Semitism it contains. But OSF mounted a courageous production. They chose not to tone down one word, presenting with unflinching honesty the ugliness we humans sometimes inflict on each other. The portrayal of Shylock by Anthony Heald was mesmerizing. Motivated by the abundant racial slurs against him, Shylock demanded his own pound of flesh, losing his daughter, his fortune, and his sanity in the process. The horrid ugliness of revenge was on full display. Rather than merely seeing a Jew, we, the audience, saw ourselves. I left the theater that night feeling like a teenager whose father, as a punishment for smoking, had made him sit in a closet and inhale a whole pack of cigarettes. I wanted to forgive anyone I'd ever known, just so I would not give myself over to the soul poison of revenge. But often, forgiveness just isn't that easy. It's loaded with emotion. It's not always rational. We cling to our wounds. There are times when I admit that I don't want to forgive. I'd rather stay hurt and fantasize about revenge. Sometimes I imagine the ones who have hurt me squirming as they realize their utter stupidity, begging for mercy, but finding none. But as the old saying goes, unforgiveness is a poison we drink hoping someone else will die. Unforgiveness shrivels the soul. Forgiveness, like wisdom, compassion, and other life-enriching gifts, is not merely a matter of supernatural willpower. It requires grace. And often That comes in its own good time. Henry Nouwen keenly observed, "Only as people who have accepted forgiveness can we find the inner freedom to give it." And accepting forgiveness isn't as easy as you might think. It requires humility and honesty, two spiritual qualities often in short supply.